Welcome to Hudson Valley MOCA. My name is Livia Straus. I'm the president of the museum and co-founder with my husband Mark. The museum opened to the public in 2004, so we're celebrating a lot of great years in the city of Peekskill, a city that's really grown and expanded its art community. The exhibition that I'm going to take you on a tour through today is How We Live Part 2. How We Live Part 1 opened immediately before the pandemic. We made a decision to leave the sculptures and the video works up so that people can enjoy them when they come back and they physically visit the institution again, and have expanded the exhibition to also include two-dimensional works. All of the works in this exhibition are from the collection. My husband and I began collecting contemporary art very early into our marriage. And part of the excitement for us was always meeting the artists, understanding their works, their cultures, their interests, what they were trying to say in presenting their art to the world. So I look forward to welcoming you in person. And if you'll join me now, we will work through this exhibition. The exhibition, How We Live Part 2, is post-pandemic, so really refers to our lives as a result of the pandemic, to the different strictures that we faced, to our use of technology, to the needs we had to be part of a community, to the isolation within community. Whereas the sculptural works refer to how we live pre-pandemic in different cultures, different countries around the world. So please join me. I'd like to start the walkthrough today with the work that's on my side by Jeffrey Gibson. Jeffrey Gibson is a Native American artist, half Choctaw, half Cherokee, and he went to very substantial art schools, graduate of the University of Chicago or the University of Chicago Art Department, and also of the Royal Academy in London. And you can see in his works hints of that classical training. Jeffrey's father was in the military, so he traveled a lot. He's from the Mississippi tribe, and a lot of his family still live there. Uniquely, Jeffrey is one of the only Native American artists that has ever been given support financially from the tribe in order to continue to art school and to really express himself. Initially, as I say, as an abstract painter, and then more and more embracing his heritage as a Native American. When I first visited Jeffrey in his studio, he was working on two sets of works. One was small pieces, and when you looked at them, they looked like beautiful paintings done on canvas, but they weren't. When you looked closer, you saw they were done on hide. And he was working on punching bags, everlast punching bags. Could they be a better metaphor for the Native Americans in the United States, that they continue to fight on, to exist, to protect their culture, despite all the adversity? The piece behind me is called Someone Great Is Gone. Within the context of what's been going on politically and culturally across the United States, this metaphor is expanded to a lot of different cultures, certainly to the Black society and certainly to the Native American society, but it embraces something else. It also embraces the environment. It embraces animal rights. Because when I saw Jeffrey in his studio, I said to him, when you work on the hides, do you do any ritual? Is there a prayer you say? He says, of course, from my culture. You thank the animal for bestowing on you the gifts of its skin, of its food, of being able to help sustain us as we create homes, tents, whatever we need from what this animal is willing to share with us. So yes, there's a ritual that's involved with it. And with this piece, an elk hide, an oversized elk hide, yes, we bemoan those things that have been lost because we weren't aware that they needed protection in our society. But now is a time for us to change. So the collection has always been a collection that's drawn from the international community, because when you have dialogues about art across continents, it enriches the conversation. It is able to break through political barriers and interpretations of what's going on in different countries and different cultures. It's a universal language. So when my husband and I visited many studios in Eastern Europe in preparation for an exhibition at the museum called After the Fall, we visited some 250 artist studios, and one of the studios was the studio of Zsolt Bödöny. So Zsolt is Hungarian, but was also living part of the time in Romania when we went to visit him. And he was drawing on the history of what came before he was born, because that whole exhibition focused on artists who were born when communism was still in control of their countries and about to collapse. So they're a generation that went from that shift from communism to a more democratic or parliamentarian system, to more freedom, to more of a say in what their government was about. When Zsolt did the painting behind me, or Tito, he wanted to show what that personality was that led the country for so many years. So you can see in the work this kind of formal, cold presentation, not the warmth of somebody with a smile, somebody who's reaching out to the community, somebody who understands and empathizes with the community. This is a human being above. Unless we forget, with all of the upheavals going on in our country over this year, Black Lives Matter, differences in political approaches, poverty versus the very wealthy, all of that went on in other cultures too. It certainly went on in this culture as there was this transition to more open labor market, to more freedom, after communism kept the people so much under control. And it's all coming out in this one piece. Zsolt did a whole series. He also did a piece on Tito's Cadillac. He did a piece on Tito's ship. So all of these signs of power over the people, transitioning now into power to the people. So as I mentioned before, the collection is an international collection. We just saw Zsolt Bödöny's work showing this very strong, staunch figure. And over here we have an artist out of Mexico, Morris. So Morris is living in a cartel-controlled community in Mexico, high crime community, although there's a control of the crime within his community by the cartel. But he's trying to draw both on the history of art as well as on his own experience living in Mexico, and referencing the mass migration that's occurring out of Latin America with this dream that everything will be better if they get to the north, if they get to the United States. So he's drawing on images from Bruegel because he sees the problems we're facing now as historic problems. They've always been there. You go through history and there are always migrations. Go back to biblical times. And there are migrations. There are migrations of the Egyptian slave population going to Canaan. There are migrations of one community to another. So he's taking a look at the history, and then he's also referencing the different objects that people bring with them in escaping to what they hope will be a better world, a new world. Basically taking all their possessions on their backs. Taking a bottle that they could drink from, things that they can dispose of along the way. And then he goes into his community and finds things simply laying on the street. So the objects that he has dangling, the boxing gloves, the different ornaments, the knives, they're all things that are being used in his community that represent what's going on around him. Those things that people are using to defend themselves, to try to build a future, maybe as a boxer, maybe as a fighter, to try to build something that's different, that's better. But his language is so intense. So, you know, I think there's a tendency to think when you look at a piece like this, oh, it's by a young artist, and they're coming at it with a very, very new view. But Morris is brilliant. And when he explains his work in a historic context, you understand that he's saying that we are all alike. We all share, no matter what, no matter our economic base, no matter our cultural background, there is a common thread that makes us part of humanity. The piece behind me is by John Wesley, of an earlier generation of artists. Became very well known in the 70s, the 80s, and became known specifically for the colors that he uses. So this pretty palette of baby blue and pretty pink, and then the black outlining. So the work behind me is called Guinness. And it's easy to think of this as kind of lighthearted, you know, especially given the pandemic where it's interesting. There were a lot of places closed, but the liquor stores were open during the entire pandemic, and it was a time for people to start appreciating cocktail hour more. This seems to be tied into that type of humor almost, this type of lightheartedness, kind of getting away from the everyday. But when you look at it closely, there's always some cynicism in his work, always a playing out of culture, of power, of the way we perceive other human beings, especially based on sex and based on culture. He did a whole series that was based on China, America, but this series, Irish Girls and Guinness, all referencing that kind of culture that came out of Ireland. And also, we know now the Me Too movement has taken on really a life of its own. And certainly this piece speaks to it. How is a woman perceived? So you take a look at John Wesley, take a look at artists like Wesselman, who really took a look and disembodied women. All you had was lips and nipples and nudes in his own way, but in a more subtle way. John Wesley is doing the same thing. He's taking a look at these differences in sexuality and the issues of power and how it's used, how it's perceived, even in the day-to-day, even in the simple. As I mentioned before that it's been very interesting watching the climate changes since the pandemic and since people stopped using their cars and transportation went on a different schedule. But it's made an enormous difference visibly in the climate around us. So the painting behind me is by Sven Kroner. He's a German artist living now outside of Düsseldorf. And there are different schools of art, especially in Europe. There's a tradition of teaching formal art, in the United States too. So the Art Students League in Manhattan is much more of a formal school of painting versus some schools like Goldsmiths in London, UCLA in the United States, where there's a much more open approach to what artists do, more experimentation, more abstraction. So Sven is coming out of a very classical school of painting. And he's coming out of a painting that's very much based on German landscape painting. So if you think even of some of the American artists or German and British artists living in the United States for a while, like Bierstadt, their landscapes are very rich. They're looking a lot at waterfalls, at homes with people in it. It's much more of a this is where we live landscape, not Sven's. He's mixing in a luminescent paint, so he also gets a certain effect from when he puts the paint on to the canvas. His paintings always have a ghostly quality, almost like a polluted quality, referring to the climate issues that face us in today's society. And very, very few people So when you come to visit the museum and you look closely at this painting, you see evidence that human beings have been here, a house here and there, a piece of farm equipment, but there are no people. The people aren't invading the landscape. His commentary is about the landscape itself. The work behind me is by another Eastern European artist, Daniel Pitton. Now, some of you who have been to the museum before might recall that Daniel Pitton was one of our artists in residence. So he draws on whatever the inspiration is from homes, people in the community, but he looks for places that have a certain mystery, a certain mystique, and a certain depressive personality. So for example, when he was here, I took him on a trip to Sing Sing, and he was very affected by that trip and started doing some paintings based on the buildings in Sing Sing prison. And then found some places around here at the top of mountaintops, old castles that looked deserted in garrison, and drew inspiration for his paintings. One painting was beautiful, was called Garrison Landing, very much influenced by what was going on in this community. So Daniel is originally from the Czech Republic. He's also of that generation of artists, born when communism was still in existence, grew up after communism had fallen. So his grandfather was also an architect in the Czech Republic and did a lot of the buildings in Prague, which is a beautiful city. Daniel had found his grandfather's blueprints in the attic of his home. So using those blueprints as an underlay for many of his paintings, he would glue them to the canvas and then paint over them. Very attracted to scenes that he would put onto the canvas that were very cinematic, very film-oriented, frequently referencing Alfred Hitchcock. That kind of mystery, that subtext of a sinister quality. So the piece behind me looks like a theater that's been totally decimated. One person coming in the hopes, I guess, of rebuilding it, looking to reestablish what was there before, what was a vibrant life, but taking a look also at the devastation and what's hidden beneath. So whenever you look at one of Daniel's paintings, or pretty much any painting actually by artists, you always have that frontal text, and then there's always that underlying text that you really have to work for. So Daniel Pitton in this particular piece. Allison Taylor, American artist this time, originally from Nevada, turning to a technique that's a much older technique, more along the lines of the technique of marqueterie or marquetry, working within different types of wood and creating her painting, her design, by blending the different wood tones and getting a real richness. She loves the concept that the nature of the wood is reflecting on the imagery that she's presenting, the work that she's presenting. So this is an early piece of Allison's. She went to school at Columbia University. We had seen her work in the graduate school there, really loved it. Thought that she had a very unique style. She was introducing a new language to her art. Of course, this piece now has extreme relevance because there's this young man, right, sitting there just working on his, computer, on his phone. He's tapping away, or on his Xbox, and glued to his technology equipment. And until the pandemic, parents were worried. They were telling their children, you're spending too much time on technology, you've got to get off the computer, you've got to get off the phone. But during the pandemic, that became the lifeline. So we felt that this piece, even though it's not of this particular time, was very relevant to what was going on in our society. That all of a sudden, technology not only was something that enriched our lives, but it was really something that became absolutely necessary for us to continue to be in contact with people, to continue our jobs, to continue to be creative. So, Allison Taylor. The piece behind me is probably one of the most challenging pieces in the exhibition. because the most daunting, the most depressing. Josef Bolf is also from the Czech Republic. His works have always drawn on the underbelly of society. Those things that are terrifying, that people deign not to discuss. So when we think about the stories that we introduce to our children, I think it was more prominent when I was growing up. Grimm's fairy tales was among the most popular stories told. And those fairy tales exist in different formats all around the world. Sometimes the final scene changes, sometimes the characters vary slightly, but they all reference the fears of childhood. This piece, Classroom, is referring to some of those fables, but also referring to the terror that Josef, also born into communism, grew up with. But given the past year, I think the biggest challenges really was in raising our children. How do you take care of them? How do you make sure that they continue to get education when they can't go to school? How do you make sure that they continue to have connections with other children when they can't play with them? And the effect on the children varied from community to community. For some, it was much harder. There were supposedly over 3 million people in the United States, children, who didn't have access to computers. So how did they continue learning? How did they have some structure to their lives? So Josef in this picture painted in this kind of devastating pink and red, a bloody scene. Animals beheaded on a desk. People in an empty classroom, basically. The chairs are upside down. There are a few children, but they're certainly distanced, very safely distanced from each other. There's no teacher. There's no leadership in the room. The children are really left to kind of fend for themselves. At the museum for the last 15 years, we've had a program where poets and playwrights come in and they write about different works that they've connected to in the exhibition. And sometimes when those poets present their works, they're getting to the heart of what the artist was really thinking about when they did the work. So it'll be interesting to see when we post the plays and the poems that will be coming in this spring and see what the writers interpret in this particular scene in the classroom. Norbert Schwankowski, Polish artist, living in Germany for a while, also integrating a metallic element into his paint so that he gets this kind of luminescence. But there's this devastating scene, right? Or kind of an open scene. There's a hotel somewhere, but you don't see it here. The plateau, the whole language, there's nothing there. There's like this shadow in the background that indicates homes far over the horizon, maybe a city far over the horizon, but this is the desolation of space. Unlike Norbert Schwankowski, who has this very open landscape with very little there, Hernan Bos, of Cuban ancestry, can't get enough into his landscapes. They are just packed. The sun is rising. There are beautiful mountains in the background with trees, waterfowl all over the place, and his signature, one lonesome male figure in the middle of the beauty, hanging out, seeing, just relaxing in the environment. So Hernan is making a statement. He's very active within the gay community, and this feeling of aloneness, but of being at peace with the self and with nature, is very much a part of his vocabulary. So when you see his works, there'll be books. The books will always deal with landscape themes. So all these heavy and pastel landscapes, and this one figure sitting in the middle and just thinking. Kind of a bucolic scene. The water birds, there's beauty all around it, and very little in terms of man's handmade work. Although there is the dock in this particular piece, but there are no homes. This is the peace of being one with nature. This painting, Three Friends, is by Șerban Savu. So Șerban is again out of that communism to freer society in Romania. Șerban and several other artists in Romania all came out of one school. It's interesting how sometimes there are movements that come out of specific schools or specific units of society. Like, for example, when Damien Hirst was in London and working with other artists that were coming out of goldsmiths, there was a new movement that was developed because you had dynamic artists that were presenting a new style, and that created the energy that moved artists like Damien Hirst forward, like Rachel Humphrey forward, like Rachel Whiteread, I'm sorry, not Rachel Humphrey. So there can be these dynamic personalities that are instituting a new style that impacts on other people. The Cluj School is a very conservative, very formal school of painting. Students work in a very open room. They're not in their own studios. Everybody has an easel set up. Everybody can look at what everybody else is doing. There was one artist that came out of the school, Adrian Gheney, that really set a certain style that other artists in the school either emulated or sought to reference. So Șerban is out of that school, classically trained. When I say classically, it's a different type of classical approach. These students learn to do iconography. How do you produce an icon for a church? What are the layers of materials that you have to put down? How do you get the effect that you want after you dig into those materials? And how do you bless it? A whole process. So this is a very classically painted piece. We chose it because the imagery was so pertinent to what's been going on in our society during the pandemic. Three friends doing construction work, making sure that they wash their hands with this bottle of water. In our case, in the United States, it would have been some sort of an antiseptic that would have protected us from passing germs around. All they're missing are the masks. If Șerban was doing this painting today, they would be masked. So a wonderful painter in a very classical style, working now, still in Cluj, in a tobacco factory that was taken over in order to be a place that houses artist studios, artist shared space, so that they can talk, they have a community, and they can grow. So we started this tour with Jeffrey Gibson, and we're going to end it with a work by A.A. Bronson, The White Flag. So if you recall with Gibson, his piece, Someone Great Is Gone, referred to his culture, but it also, of course, is so potent, so powerful for us today with the losses in our community. Well, Mark and I started collecting, we began in the 70s, but we collected very heavily in the 80s, because the 80s was a super exciting time in the art world. Artists were doing all sorts of experimental things. Jeff Koons was doing his basketballs in his fish tank, and you had people just experimenting with a lot of different languages. And then, of course, in the beginning of the 90s, there was the devastation of the AIDS epidemic. And a lot of people in the art world died. A.A. Bronson was born in the 1940s, I think 1946, in Canada. His name was Michael Timms. He changed it. He took on another name, as did a lot of his other cohorts in the art world, taking on an identity that they felt represented who they wanted to be, and not something that was given to them by somebody else, a name given to them by somebody else. He became part of a consortium of artists known as General Idea, varied between 5 artists and 7 artists, all part of the same group. And he became close specifically with 2 of the artists, Jorge and Felix, who unfortunately died of AIDS in 1994. When Mark and I went to see Abe Ronson's show in which he documented the death of Felix and the death of Jorge from AIDS, making a statement about the devastation being caused to one community of human beings. Other people in the society at that time were afraid of them, afraid to get near people from the gay community, really putting the blame for this disease squarely on the gay community. And whatever types of prejudices that community faced before, it was multiplied during that time, during the same time that people were mourning losses of dear friends. Whether you were from the straight community or the gay community, everybody cried for that creativity that was lost. In White Flag, well, you know, you can use your imagination as to what this represents. We had a series that was much more overt that was presented by an artist in residence that we had that was called Black Flags. White Flag could be a whitewash of all the pain that's been caused in the past. It's interesting that the materials that he uses, canvas, rope, and honey. So this is all honey infused, kind of the pain that's overlaid with what seems to be sweetness in society. So this for me is a piece that is very powerful. It really speaks to the empathy that we need to nurture in our society, caring for human beings across any differences, across any lines, because ultimately, in the end, we're all the same. So I hope you've enjoyed this short tour, walkthrough, and that you will take an opportunity to visit the show in person and to let us know your own impressions, what you see in the works and how they affect you. So keep safe and keep well.